Welcome to On Healing. This is my podcast where I like to talk about healing and related topics. And feels like I oftentimes like to draw from my experience of my last 10 years working on myself, growing myself, and learning about healing in different ways. And such a broad topic, right? And I think a lot of the times we're talking about something that pertains to healing without even being aware of it. So I feel like I could be more specific about counseling or mental health or philosophy and at times spirituality. But I feel like when I just say we're talking about healing, I think most of you get what I'm talking about. And most of you can relate to what I'm exploring. So, without further ado, let's jump on in. Right now I'm on Buntzen Lake. Some know it as Buntzen Lake. I think of it as Beautiful Lake, its previous name, adjacent to Eagle Mountain, which is on the Coquitlam Nation's land. It's unceded land. And the Tsleil-Waututh Nation is the rightful traditional stewards and wisdom keepers of these lands. And when I do this land acknowledgement, I feel it's important for us to not simply just make the acknowledgement as an empty gesture or as a box tick that, all right, we're done and now we can move on. I feel like the land acknowledgement is a call to action that requires more of us as allies, settlers, even those who are Indigenous. They will do a call to action with an intention. And my intention is that you get curious about the ways that you can actively support Indigenous communities, whether that be studying, big breeze of wind, maybe it's telling me I'm onto something. No, but studying the history of the Indigenous peoples of your local territory or the local band, wherever you live, just getting curious about what the history of that land is and what Indigenous nations are connected to it. And then also understanding what colonization is and the impact that has on your life and the people in your life. And also understanding that there are plenty of Indigenous businesses, artists, and I would say workshops or events that are going on in most local communities. So just getting curious about, okay, well, if you're making these land acknowledgements or if you're hearing this call to action, perhaps you can take the next step and become connected to that community in some way and support that community in some way. So I'm just so blessed to be here. I feel so blessed to walk these lands and be in a place of reconciliation and feeling like that's something that I can do, and I have access to community spaces that support my efforts, right? I can imagine there was a time not so long ago where even if somebody wants to, say, speak words or take action in a way that is fostering reconciliation, it wouldn't be, I want to say easy, but maybe not even possible. Might not even be possible depending on where you live and what the history of that land is, right? And what generation that you're a part of or you're connected to. Yeah, today I'm feeling very grateful. I'm going to spend some time talking with my family, which I do a lot, but today we're going to talk about boundaries. And this is a conversation that's been a long time coming, It's been, I would say, maybe since the time where my parents had initially realized they wanted to have a family. Ideally, they would have known how to set clear and intentional boundaries so that they could have created the safety within their relationship that they could have extended unto our family. And then I would say there would be a lot more connection and willingness to move through conflict within my family. But I just want to say it's oftentimes it's not too late if you're feeling like your family is a complete nightmare and you wouldn't even touch that subject of boundary setting. I'd like to just invite you to get curious about what's the first step. If you feel like your family is very disconnected or really needs to understand the topic of boundaries, what would be the first step? Is it just to get them in the same space? Is it just to, in some way, initiate contact with them if you're disconnected or they're very disconnected from each other? I just want to acknowledge some families are too far gone, and maybe even just to do that is too much. But if there is a possibility and there's a hope that you can get your family into the same space just in a meeting, and you can try to initiate connection and just have conversations with one another and try to hear each other out in some capacity. And then over time, maybe the conversation of boundaries can be respectfully brought up. I would say that it can do a lot of healing, not just for that family, but that ripples out into the other members of the family, maybe their sisters or your cousins, and maybe, your next of kin will feel the ripple of that too. So it's really important to have these conversations, even if you feel reluctant to do so. And yeah, kind of looking forward to that, It's been something I've been building up to and planting the seeds for, right? So really grateful that I'm able to have that space, and I've made that space. And there's something of an openness to have that conversation. It wasn't like I came to this conclusion overnight. It actually was the result of a lot of counseling and a lot of being witnessed by my therapist in my anger, right? In my feelings of hopelessness around how the family was disconnected and how difficult it was to set boundaries, and how poorly people would receive me when I set boundaries. And it just took a lot of really getting into my anger and owning it and voicing it and feeling validated in my experience and not having people invalidate it, and really trying to just feel into my raw experience of anger. This has been a really powerful shift for me. Because there is power within anger. You're reclaiming your power. You're reclaiming sovereignty. You're making things happen, right? You're setting boundaries. But our relationship to anger, at least I can speak from my experience, my relationship to anger as a man, it's been very complicated. I think I really just repressed most of my anger for 31 years, just pretending it didn't exist, being afraid of it, seeing other men as the aggressive, maybe uncontrolled, primal expression of anger. Like, there's the archetype of anger that's out there, and those are the people who have problems, quote unquote. And I'm over here, and because I can dull it out and desensitize myself to my emotional experience, that I'm somehow better or better off being disconnected from anger. And the embracing the impotency that comes along with that. Playing small, hurting people through passive aggressiveness, fostering resentment towards people and allowing that resentment to eat away at you over time. It's interesting because you become selfless. You start to abandon yourself if you don't express your anger or utilize it to advocate for yourself or sometimes for others, right? You become dulled and, one might say, neutral or diluted in your expression, in your passion. And it's so interesting how much these other traits that aren't necessarily angry, right? Good traits, things like integrity, things like courage, things like passion, things like creativity in some ways. They require a driving force. They require a spark to be initiated. One could even say deeper, more heartfelt love ought to be initiated through actions. You need to do something. You need to bravely speak your needs and set boundaries to create safety, right? And that extends unto creating a secure, loving relationship. But we don't think about these things as being connected to anger. We think about these things as being, in some way, the opposite, or anger's on the other side over there, where someone's just screaming at somebody. And we're so quick to assume that the person who has a healthy relationship to anger, or expresses their anger at times, more so, can't also hold a lot of love and compassion and safety. Whereas that's the very person that has that capacity. Once they've conquered or worked with or created space for their quote-unquote demons, those are the safest people in the world to be around, because they don't have their shadow causing problems left and right. They don't have these stray demons playing tricks behind the scene and causing all these different issues in their life. So that's just my perception of why it's important to sit with your anger and to go to therapy, ideally, or find ways to really sit with anger and have a relationship to it. And why I do believe anger tears apart, at least it can tear apart our relationships. It can create such a disconnect from other people, especially our family, right? That if unaddressed, it can slowly erode our capacity to just be in connection with others. Yeah, it's been a beautiful rekindling of my sacred flame. It's been a rocky and rugged integration of my authentic sense of my fire. And sobriety, I believe it kind of serves as this hearth or this fire pit, this protective ring where the sacred flame can begin to be built. But without that containment, without that hearth and that foundation having first been built, I believe it becomes very difficult to build a strong, sustainable, sacred flame. The conditions need to be right. And I don't want to say that I fully understand how each one of us builds our sacred flame, and that for each individual, full-on sobriety needs to look this way, and then, that's step one to building this flame. But for me, it most certainly has been. Recognizing even nicotine, which is such a highly addictive plant, yet it has such a beautiful spirit if you can commune with it and build the relationship to that sacred plant. But even within a nicotine addiction, I felt like I was still not able to sit with my sacred flame. So I think something as simple as smoking weed or smoking nicotine continually every day, or drinking to kind of numb the pain, or for other reasons. And then of course psychedelics even. I think psychedelics can serve a similar role where they take you just far away enough from your authentic felt experience that it can become very challenging to just feel the rough edges of your pain. Whether it's in the body, maybe sometimes it's some kind of a cycle or pattern that you're noticing for the first time, and you're trying to actually change for the first time in a long time. Maybe it's just looking at your relationships and reassessing things with clarity, which I think with psychedelics can be very difficult if you're, depends how you're using that psychedelic, of course, but I think many times it can be difficult to assess one's life when you're focusing on, let's just say, these astral realms, or where the altered states can bring you towards deeper levels of clarity, and I think often do. I think depending on the psychedelic, many times it's sort of shaking the Etch-a-Sketch once again, and it's redistributing your neural firing and not really giving you a chance to really just reconstruct a model of thinking and perceiving your life and yourself and your habits and your patterns. And it becomes about something outside of you, oftentimes. And I will say this, if you do psychedelics and then you apply IFS, so you sit and ideally work with a practitioner who understands how to do IFS, I do believe it helps a lot more than if you aren't doing either of those two. Like if you aren't using psychedelics, or you're not going to therapy, or you're not using IFS on a regular basis, even on your own, I think it becomes a lot more difficult to just start to notice these patterns and how they take shape, or what form they take in your life, what role these parts play. And they start to become more blended and more elusive, and it becomes so difficult to access what's called self. And that's where I would say you can get away with pretty much any spiritual practice that allows you to attune to what one might call God consciousness. And that does also help you, at the very least, notice if you're stuck in a mindset or a mentality, or your body's starting to become dysregulated, and there's that moment by moment kind of scanning. So yeah, I kind of went off the topic of anger for a bit, but I do feel that for me, working with anger has required me to have a lot of moment-to-moment awareness. And it's required that clarity of mind, which I've had to earn and really work towards by stripping away all substances and anything that was interrupting that clarity. And then also having that mirror in a therapy space, and maybe just having practiced IFS enough times where I can notice where if I'm in a part, at the very least, I can try to work with it and not just get sort of like stuck in that part for long periods of time, unconsciously, just kind of letting it play out and react and basically control things in my life. You got to interrupt the ripple, especially if you're working with anger for the first time in a long time. Anger is going to trigger a lot of traumatized inner protector parts that want to start to control you again in different ways, using their polarized views of the world, right? And when you're feeling into your anger, those parts can actually sort of weaponize that anger in a way that's not necessarily hurting other people directly, but it's usually hurting you. It's usually directed towards you, and that can cause harm in your life to others. If, let's just say your burdened, polarized parts that are now fueled by the anger that you're feeling into for the first time, they start to disrupt your self-care, or they start to make you sort of do certain things that you wouldn't do otherwise that are actually pretty harmful to your well-being. Could just be another process addiction, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be self-harm, but it could be. But in some way, they're making your life harder, these parts of you that are now feeling empowered, and that'll ripple out into your relationships, which makes it harder for you to receive support, except for if you're with a therapist who understands these things, who can ideally understand and work with that part. But I think in many cases, we don't have people that understand how to hold space for these angry parts of us, or these parts that have felt shame and are overly defensive, or, right? Like these parts that are in some way just trying to protect us, but doing it in pretty extreme ways. And if there's somebody who doesn't understand IFS or hasn't done that inner work and maybe doesn't have a relationship with their own anger, they might pick up on your parts, and that'll trigger their parts. And then all of a sudden, bam, you're in conflict. Bam, there's no more safety. And oftentimes that's the end of that. And by the way, not everyone's meant to be everybody's quote unquote therapist, or needs to hold space for your anger in that way. But I would say the more people you have in your life that can hold space for that can at least at the very bare minimum create safety for you and not make things worse, I would say you're going to be able to validate your experience of anger much more quickly and feel like you can actually work with it and understand it more deeply. And you're not facing the backlash of your parts that are now coming in and trying to defend you against other people's parts, right? Yeah, I guess this is just an interesting tangent, but it's like, how do you enter into conflict? Right? How do you enter into conflict? I'm no expert here, but I guess I'm just opening this question. Whoever's listening, in what ways do you engage in conflict? Are you someone who has trauma around conflict, maybe from your childhood, maybe from a past relationship, where entering into conflict is not safe, or having a conversation that's difficult becomes a conflict very quickly? And if this is the case, I'm curious how you might want to approach conflict if you had the ability to work with the parts of you that want to kind of tear down the other person and impose your beliefs onto them and quote unquote be right? But if you're able to work with the parts of you that normally would do those things in advance, so you can work with them before getting into that conflict or before having that conversation, essentially preparing in some kind of way, how might you approach that conflict differently? How might you be able to approach conflict as a whole? Not trying to avoid conflict, or I think in some ways we could get stuck in a kind of neutralizing mentality where we need to turn the conflict into a quote unquote neutral conversation. But I don't think that's realistic either. I feel like there's a balance there where if you can notice dysregulation where someone's fully shut down, and then have the ability to just bring awareness to that so that people aren't just like yelling at each other where they're both dysregulated and nobody knows how to maintain just that shred of, one might say, self-energy or balance or harmony from the conversation. Well, yeah, that's the extreme that I'd say one ought to avoid. But if you can also create a type of stability within yourself so that you can move through conflict, there's a kind of determination and openness and curiosity that you can move through the stages of how your body perceives and is triggered by conflict, and also an openness to understand the other person in front of you. I would say conflict can turn into problem solving and space holding versus a war that feels like it just ripples out over a long period of time. It doesn't actually end. It's just an ongoing war. And that's what I'm trying to do. I don't think I've by any means figured it out, but I'm trying to create that degree of how can I be open to advocating for my needs, understanding that boundaries need to be set, and trying my best to not get hyper polarized by one of my parts when I'm in a conversation with another person that becomes heated or kind of conflict adjacent, let's just say. Maybe just noticing what is my intention for having that conversation. If I'm able to reach a point of conclusion within that, all right, what do I do then? If it feels like the conflict is kind of raging out of control, there's a wildfire just raging out of control, is there a way I know the right time to set the boundary to contain the fire? To know that maybe I just can leave the room and they need to sort of let it burn out. Maybe it's something that can be contained and there's less oxygen feeding that wildfire, and then all of a sudden it just sort of slowly shrinks. And then it's at a manageable level where two people can talk about it. Depends who you're dealing with, right? But I do believe we can learn a lot about how people respond, well, firstly, to our anger, but at the same time, if we're able to notice and create safety for our parts, how that changes the experience for the other person who maybe doesn't necessarily want to be angry, right? There's something that they're advocating for. There's a boundary they might be trying to set. There's a reason you're having that conversation. But when you're in the throes of these protector parts, they're just so focused on safety, they just can't see what's in front of them, or they maybe have a hard time finding the words. So I think patience is another really big piece I've been trying to practice for talking with my family, for maybe just how I perceive my family. And that takes a lot of, mindfulness, but also just trying to see what the long game is. Not necessarily trying to focus on what I need to change right away, but just trying to see if I can visualize a long game and focusing and shifting my efforts towards the long game. And sometimes the long game looks like setting a boundary you wouldn't think you would have to set, but might need to set, right? Like, I don't want to say that you always need to jump to this like axing, kind of cutting people off extreme. But I think if there are people in your life that you're having issues with, I think you ought to entertain that as the most extreme option and then move your way towards the middle ground and sit in more neutral solutions as often as possible before entertaining that, but knowing that that's on the table. So whoever needs to hear this, it's always on the table to cut someone out of your life. Now you need to know that it's not appropriate to do that in many cases. But if that is what you need to do, it's always an option. And I think many times we're stuck in a part that's scared of what might happen if we set that extreme boundary, right? And I think it's worth considering that our needs are important, and we have to focus on us first before caretaking and before maybe trying to save another person and focusing on what they're going through and feeling guilty when they are still struggling and we're, in a way, kind of cleared of that energy. So thank you for tuning in. It's been a beautiful day of sitting by the lake. I'm going to get home and have that meeting. But for anyone listening, I just want to let you know that I'm trying to get more into community building, in a sense, I guess. I'm trying to get my men's group going, and I'm trying to also get people into art workshops, which will be by donation. You know, if you feel called, you'll reach out. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and take care for now. Bye. Are you making space for your inner healer to blossom? Are you making space for that self, that deeper sense of self to shine through? If you'd be interested in working with me one-on-one, please reach out through featheroflightcounseling@outlook.com. Aside from that, go out to your favorite nature spot and pray for me, and I will pray for you. And a heartfelt thank you for being a friend. Take care.